Short history of Afghanistan to try to understand what happened with the Taliban recently, not just this botched withdrawal, which is more than just a botched withdrawal, it's a botched war. This war was 5 months longer than the war in Vietnam, so the longest war in US history, 20 years. And then this rapid resurgence of the Taliban that surprised some people for some reason. So I'm just going to look at the long history of wars on Afghanistan and try to understand this fundamentalist religious reaction that developed there. So this is Afghanistan, landlocked country in Southwest Asia, bordering with Iran, Pakistan, and China. To its north are Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, all ex-Soviet countries. And then to the north of that, we have Russia. This is an elevation map of Afghanistan that I chose more to look at fertility, because you can read it like a fertility map. The most fertile area is the northern plains, that green strip near the northern border with Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. That's the most fertile area in Afghanistan. A lot of rice and cotton is grown there. It's also rich in natural gas and minerals. The Central Mountains area in red is the Hindu Kush mountain range. Very extreme contrast of elevations, mountains and valleys. It's the western extension of the Himalayas. You can see the white part spilling over from China, India. So it's kind of like the western end of the Himalayas. And it's mostly infertile. And it's most of the landmass of Afghanistan. And then you have the southern plains, the yellow-orange part in the south. It's mostly deserts and semi-deserts, but it has some arable land. That's where most of the poppy is grown, what you make opiates from. And Afghanistan supplies 80% of the world's heroin. There's some opiates grown also in the northwest area, where you also see some orange, an orange strip there, but most of it is in the south. This is a CIA map that I kind of added captions to simplify it a little. It shows the different ethnic groups, and you can see it's this massive patchwork of many different ethnic groups. The white part at the bottom means mostly uninhabited. And then you have the large strips of purple and pink. Those are Pashtun people who speak Pashto, sometimes known as Afghani. The name Afghanistan just means land of the Pashtuns. They're the largest group in the country, about 40% of the population. Not unified. There are subgroups, different kinds of Pashtun people that have been at odds with each other over the years. Almost all the kings of Afghanistan have been Pashtun, and most of the Taliban is Pashtun today. The second largest group is the Tajiks, who are about 20% of the population. They speak Farsi, which is another Iranian language, but very different from Pashto. Then there are various Turkic people in the north, like Turkmen and Uzbeks. That's those orange, yellow patches in the north. All the groups that I mentioned so far are predominantly Sunni Muslim. Then there are the poorest and most oppressed people in Afghanistan, the Hazara people in the center, in the mountain range, who are predominantly Shia Muslim. And they're about 9% of the population. And then there are many other smaller groups. So now some history. The area that is now called Afghanistan was one of the first regions in the world to develop agriculture and domestication of animals. Since then, many small local kingdoms rose and fell through the ages, and starting from the 6th century BC, we see some of the famous empires of antiquity conquering the region. The Persian Empire, then Greek with Alexander's conquest, then Kushan Empire that introduced Buddhism in the region, then Persian and Han. In the 7th century AD, the Muslim Arab conquest introduced Islam, still the dominant religion today. In the early 13th century, Genghis Khan conquered Afghanistan. The Hazara groups that I mentioned earlier from the Central Mountain Range came from this conquest. It's basically the intermarriage between Mongols and local tribes. In 1747, just before the Industrial Revolution, the modern kingdom of Afghanistan was established when Pashtun lords elected a king, Ahmed Shah Durrani. So Ahmed Shah Durrani conquered the fertile areas of Peshawar, Sindh, and Kashmir, which are today a part of Pakistan and India. These fertile plains provided the agricultural produce needed to maintain a royal army and the central government. But then they were conquered back by the Sikhs of Punjab, and the Kingdom of Afghanistan was severely weakened economically and became really dependent on foreign aid, and that's the case to this day. By the 1830s, the British and Russian empires competed with each other over colonial control of Afghanistan and the neighboring countries in what is known as the Great Game. The British attempted to take Afghanistan twice in the two Anglo-Afghan wars and were defeated each time. The tradition of fighting under Islam against the invading infidels was established at that time and continues to this day. In 1880, after the Second Anglo-Afghan War, the British realized they can't conquer the country, but they can buy it. They armed and subsidized Emir Abdur Rahman. Emir is basically like king, who ruled the country with extreme brutality. He and his successors were hated by the Afghan peasants, especially the non-Pashtuns, who saw him as a puppet of British infidels. In 1919, King Amanullah tried to end British control over Afghan politics by attacking British India and initiated the Third Anglo-Afghan War, which is also known as the War of Independence. The war ended with the British withdrawing their subsidy and imposing the southern border of Afghanistan, the Durand Line, that's the red border in this map, between Afghanistan and British India. And then the area to the south became Pakistan later in 1947 when the British partitioned India. Deprived of this fertile territory below the Durand Line and having lost British subsidy, the Afghan economy began to fall apart. King Amanullah had to face the problems of the kings that preceded him, how to control the local landlords. For centuries, the peasants of Afghanistan had been exploited by landlords called Khans with their armed retinues who worked the peasants and shepherds in their area through what we call sharecropping or share herding. I thought I was going to make up this word, but apparently there's a word share herding, same as sharecropping, but for shepherds. The kings found it very hard to maintain their centralized state because the landlord, the Khans, didn't want to pay tax, and they were very powerful. They were locally powerful, but when it came to kind of like centralized politics, they would sometimes get together to resist this king or that king. This forced the kings to tax the peasants again instead and alienate them. Amanullah was in the same position as his predecessors, but he did not have the subsidy from the British to compensate for that because of the War of Independence. So he imposed taxes on tribes that had been exempt before and was unable to break the Khans, tax the peasants. Now this enabled the religious leaders, the mullahs, to unite the peasantry against the king on a religious basis. A century of holy wars against the British and the repeated attempts by kings to break the Khans gave rise to Islamic fundamentalism. So in the early 19th century, before all this, the Pashtuns practiced a pretty relaxed and liberal form of Islam. In the centuries since, the Afghan peasants fought against the British 3 times and rebelled against kings that they had subsidized. Each time, the peasants united under Islam. When Amanullah tried to modernize the country, sort of like what Ataturk was doing in Turkey, he now met with increased resistance from radicalized landlords and religious leaders, especially when he tried to separate mosque and state. His reforms included greater investment in education, unveiling of women and access to education for women, a consultative parliament, and Western-style clothing for men. The attempt to abolish the burqa in Kabul offended the landlords and mullahs most of all, and it sparked a revolt against King Amanullah, who had to flee the country in 1929. Amanullah's overthrow, began the Afghan Civil War of 28-29. After a few coups and one assassination, a relative of Amanullah named Muhammad Zahir Shah, who was in the photo here with Kennedy, claimed the throne and held it until 1973. Zahir received subsidies from the British and later in the Cold War period, subsidies from the Soviet Union, British, and the United States. Zahir continued the attempts of his predecessors to modernize Afghanistan and faced the same kind of resistance from the local landlords, the Khans. As a result, he was unable to modernize agriculture, and Afghanistan retained this kind of feudal or semi-feudal economy. The foreign aid that Zahir Shah received was spent mostly on the military, education system, and the government. His modest liberal reforms created a new educated middle class and a radicalization of Afghan students centered in the capital, Kabul. The international student movement of the 60s also reached Afghanistan, and students started to demonstrate for more democracy, freedom of speech, and women students protested against the veil. This expansion of the educated middle class gave rise both to a radical left and more Islamic reaction to the secular reforms. So now we enter the period of Stalinism in Afghanistan. The Communist Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, which is People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, was established in 1965 and was Stalinist from the beginning. By 1967, it had split into two factions, Parcham, which means banner or flag, and Khalq, or Khalq, which means people. Parcham were rooted in the middle-class intelligentsia and were more moderate. They advocated for gradual government reforms to develop Afghanistan along capitalist lines so that it's ready for socialism in the future. In the 70s, the working class was only 30,000 people out of 13 million citizens. So it gives you an idea of how underdeveloped the country is and why that position would seem reasonable in some sense. The Khalq, the more radical faction of the PDPA, were based in the rural areas and advocated for armed insurrection. In 1973, with the help of Russia, Zahir Shah was replaced by his cousin, Prime Minister Mohammad Daoud, in a bloodless coup. While Zahir was out of the country, I think he was getting some kind of medical treatment in Italy or something, and then Mohammad Daoud just took his place. This ended 225 years of monarchy and established a single-party republic in Afghanistan. This republic, however, was similar to the monarchies that came before it. It was a repressive police state that tried to modernize the country, only now it was subsidized primarily by Russia. Daoud persecuted the conservative Muslim leaders, and then under the influence of the Shah of Iran, who was a puppet of the United States, Daoud also went after the Communist Party. Then he alienated the Soviet Union that brought him into power in the first place by refusing their demand to stop trade with non-Soviet aligned countries in Western Europe, Saudi Arabia, Iran. The Khalq faction, the radicals, had opposed Daoud's government from the beginning and were forced to go underground. Parcham, the more moderate faction of the Communist Party, tried to work with Daoud at first and even helped him with his repression and exile of the conservative Muslim leaders, but then went underground as well when Daoud turned against them. In 1977, after both factions found themselves underground, they held a unification congress, and in 1978, the unified PDPA, not for long, but momentarily unified PDPA, overthrew Daoud's government in a military coup, which is described by the mainstream media as a communist coup. The Khalq faction had done most of the organizing for this coup in the military, but not among the soldiers, but the officers. So this was a revolution from above. It's known sometimes as the Tsar Revolution. It was carried out on the backs of the peasant majority and the workers, not by them. Having organized the seizure of power by military coup, the Khalq faction held the top positions in the new government. They moved to secularize the state, expand literacy, emancipate women from oppressive religious customs. The most difficult was their attempted land reform, which meant opposing the Khans and trying to dismantle Afghan feudalism. A common slogan of communist students for years before the takeover had been death to the Khans. So this communist party in power had to at least try to subdue them. This was impossible because the PDPA did not organize the peasants and workers, only the military officers. And even worse, by the late 70s, Islamic fundamentalism had hardened under a century and a half of holy wars. The peasants saw this new communist, quote unquote, government as a foreign element, sending secular men in Western suits to tax them over and above the Khans and unveil the women. So the mullahs, the village religious teachers, were able to lead peasant revolts against this godless government. In response, the PDPA turned to police repression, arrests, and torture. Under this pressure, the two factions of the PDPA, the Khalq and Parcham, split again. In 1978, the Parcham ministers were purged by Khalq from all government positions. And then in 1979, they started actually assassinating each other. Not to mention Khalq police, the Afghan police, which was controlled by Khalq now, executed tens of thousands of people across the country. The Soviet Union's KGB supported this repression, but it didn't work very well. The military shrank from about 200,000 to less than 50,000 people because so many people deserted. And the government began to really lose control over the countryside as there were more and more local revolts breaking out. So when the leaders of the Soviet Union saw that the PDPA does not have things under control in Afghanistan, they invaded the country in December 1979. The main motivation of the bureaucracy, the USSR bureaucracy in Moscow, to invade was their natural gas, which had been coming in from Afghanistan since, I think, 67, late 60s in any case. In addition, the fall of the PDPA government by fundamentalist Muslim reaction would have sparked revolution against the USSR and the countries to Afghanistan's north, which were part of the USSR and ethnically and religiously contiguous with it. For example, there's Tajikistan, land of the Tajiks north of Afghanistan, but there are actually more Tajiks in Afghanistan than there are in Tajikistan. The invading Russians killed the cult leaders, replaced them with people from the other faction, Parcham, while the Red Army, the Russian army, ravaged the country. This invasion trapped Russia into a decade of guerrilla warfare. The Red Army used bombing, extensive landmines, and napalm. The US Secretary of Defense called it Russia's Vietnam. Kandahar, the second largest city, was carpet bombed and its population reduced from 250,000 to 25,000. The fighters that resisted the Red Army, that fought against it, called themselves Mujahideen, which means people of jihad, holy war. They organized on a community basis, sometimes with different communities banding together into larger guerrilla formations. The Mujahideen received aid and intelligence from the military dictatorship in Pakistan and its secret police, the ISI. Military and financial aid, which is estimated to have been between $6 and $12 billion, also came from Saudi Arabia, the US, and even China, all funneled through the Pakistani ISI, which skimmed a lot of it. And there was a lot of corruption there. The CIA was not really happy about stoking Islamic fundamentalism by arming the Mujahideen, but Cold War logic prevailed, which meant being against the Soviet Union and temporarily supporting the Mujahideen. There's a photo on Wikipedia of Ronald Reagan sitting with Mujahideen leaders in the Oval Office and I guess discussing how much they hate communism or something like that. Throughout the war, the Mujahideen opposed land reform, so the feudal economy remained, often with Mujahideen leaders replacing the old Khans, the landlords, and acting more or less the same way. The resistance to the Soviet invasion brought about a huge expansion in the farming of poppy that makes heroin. Heroin processing plants were built in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This too was supported by the CIA, just as they had done in Vietnam during the war. The money skimmed by the CIA from this Afghan-Pakistani heroin trade funded its international arms smuggling. The Soviet invasion killed between 1 and 2 million people. 6 million became refugees. The USSR was forced to withdraw after a decade without achieving their aims of establishing a stable pro-Soviet government. This defeat precipitated the fall of the Soviet Union 2 years later, late 1991. The Soviet invaders to this day are identified with communism throughout Afghanistan. So if you want to organize a socialist group in Afghanistan, it's going to be hard. When the Soviet army withdrew, the US cut off all support for the Mujahideen. With the Soviet Union gone and the fundamentalist Muslim parties in Pakistan discredited in the eyes of most Mujahideen, Afghanistan military and political organizing drew increasingly on ethnic divisions. Even the Khalq faction, which were supposedly communists in some sense, of the PDPA became Pashtun ultra-nationalists. A civil war between various Mujahideen groups, forces allied with the Pakistani parties, and as well as Khalq forces continued into the mid-90s. During the Soviet-Afghan War, the military dictatorship in Pakistan funded many madrasas, which means religious schools, Muslim religious schools, along the border with Afghanistan, which spread Wahhabism, the extreme form of Islam, from Saudi Arabia. These schools trained a generation of mullahs, religious leaders, and students who started a movement known as the Taliban. The word means students, and in this context, you can say it means students of Islam, which aimed to purify Islam in Afghanistan of all the corruption, what they saw as corruption. They began organizing south of Kandahar as vigilantes, killing Mujahideen warlords that had been terrorizing their villages. With the help of the Pakistani secret police, the ISI, the Taliban forces took Kandahar and expanded from there, seizing poppy fields and towns and disarming people. Many Mujahideen joined them without a fight, as well as former Khalq commanders and Pakistani ex-military. The US, this is the Clinton administration now, supported the Taliban because they seemed to offer peace, which for the US means the ability of corporations to control gas pipelines there. Some of the gas infrastructure was still owned by Russia at the time. By 2001, the Taliban enforced the veil on women in cities and destroyed half of the public schools in Afghanistan. The Pakistani secret police, the ISI, having armed and supported the Taliban from the beginning, effectively controlled the organization by the 2000s. This is an interesting quote that I just want to read almost in full from Ahmed Rashid's popular book on the Taliban that contrasts them to the previous generation of fighters, the Mujahideen who fought against the Soviets. Many of these young warriors, the Taliban that is, did not even know the history of their own country or the story of the jihad against the Soviets. These boys were a world apart from the Mujahideen, whom I had got to know during the 1980s. Men who could recount their tribal and clan lineages, remembered their abandoned farms and valleys with nostalgia, and recounted legends and stories from Afghan history. These boys were from a generation who had never seen their country at peace. They had no memories of their tribes, their elders. They were literally the orphans of the war. They admired war because it was the only occupation they could possibly adapt to. Their simple belief in a messianic Puritan Islam, which had been drummed into them by simple village mullahs, was the only prop they could hold on to and which gave their lives some meaning. When Al-Qaeda, which supported the Taliban, took responsibility for the September 11th attacks, and the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden, the US had the perfect excuse to attack Afghanistan. The primary interest, as usual, had nothing to do with bin Laden or 9/11, but US control over oil and gas in the region, as well as the opening of Afghanistan to US capital. After negotiating with the Taliban in early 2001 and reaching an impasse, the US invaded, and like Russia in the 80s, got trapped in endless guerrilla resistance against the Taliban. Among the ordinary people of Afghanistan, there was some support for US and UN troops early on, but this has decreased as civilian deaths from US attacks mounted. There were over 250,000 deaths and 2 million refugees as a result of this war. Much of the foreign aid was misappropriated because of the dysfunction of the US-backed government, but the country saw some improvements, such as in education. The total number of enrolled students increased from 1 to 10 million. The number of teachers increased by 58%. Female literacy almost doubled from 17 to 30%. Maternal mortality was reduced by half, and the rate of child marriage, which means girls who are forced to marry at a very young age, has been reduced somewhat by 17%. Not great, but something. More than 5.7 million former refugees have returned to Afghanistan, mostly refugees from the Afghan-Soviet War and the civil war that came after, since the Taliban was removed from power. Women were also able to participate in politics as Taliban restrictions were lifted, and women held 27% of the seats in parliament. This, for example, is Salima Mazari, who was a district governor in Balkh province. You can see that she needs a lot of protection. This dude to her left is holding a machine gun, not just an assault rifle, but a machine gun. It's crazy. In May 2021, as US forces withdrew, the Taliban launched an offensive and rapidly took over most of the country. By August, they seized Kabul and every major city in the country. Tens of thousands of Afghan citizens have been scrambling to get out of the country, fearing the return to Taliban rule, like the late 90s. The US military has flown out over 120,000 citizens. Pakistan, which had already taken 1.4 million Afghanis in 2020, has now closed its borders to further refugees, as did Iran. Uzbekistan will only temporarily host refugees, they say. Temporarily as in then move them to another country. And Turkmenistan and Tajikistan have not yet committed to accepting refugees. 3.5 million people are displaced within Afghanistan. 14 million people, which is a third of the population currently, are suffering from hunger due to droughts and the destruction of the economy. So that brings us to right now.